So without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker this evening. Knuckey is a writer focused on climate energy in the Antarctic. She is also a former Climate Reality Bay Area chapter co-chair and was trained as a climate reality leader in Los Angeles in 2018. She is co-founder of Inc., an innovative battery company in the East Bay, and has held positions in the industry ranging from strategy consultant with the McKinsey & Company energy practice to leading the Enphase energy global marketing team. She has written countless articles in the United States and Australia, where she grew up and began her career as a financial and energy journalist. Her books have been featured in media ranging from Bloomberg News to Oprah. She holds an MBA and an MS in sustainable design and lives in San Anselmo. So welcome, Dej, and I'll turn it over.
Thank you very much, Harriet. And thank you to everyone tuning in. I know there's some folks who may be tuning in from the other side of the world or who will be watching this at a later time, because there's a few folks from around the world who've booked in. So what I'd like to do is just talk about a place that's I think of as being the subconscious of the world. This is a place right down the bottom. It's a place we don't think about a lot day to day. Most people don't think about a lot day to day, but really kind of like our subconscious, if this is broken, the whole planet will suffer. And so what I'd like to do is kind of start out setting a bit of context about a trip that I did with another climate organization. As we all know, there's a lot of groups out there doing a lot of work, and tell you a little about the program that I went on and its goals, and then step back a good 50, 60 years, talk about some of where climate activism kind of began in the Antarctic, and then touch base on some of the key issues about the Antarctic and give you a sense of some of what we saw there and also what's really crucial in the industry. So I was down there in March with something called the 2041 ClimateForce expedition. And this was 170 folks. You can tell I was there because I circled myself, but there were a lot of people from 35 countries. It was just a fantastic program where almost everyone there was a climate leader. And what we saw was a group of people ranging from deeply experienced folks in the climate space through to a whole lot of really experienced, very young people who had been part of they'd been part of like COP26 youth force and so forth. So it was a really diverse and exciting group to be down there with. And a lot of what happened was day in, day out, we would get to go to shore. We would float around looking at icebergs as they looked at us. We would go on land to hear from some of these extremely experienced biologists and so forth who were on the ship as part of the expedition. And also, of course, see all the wildlife there. Most of the wildlife that we saw was incredibly photogenic, rather grumpy, very fat because they were heading into winter. But the most important wildlife you didn't really see at all, and that was the krill. And you'll begin to see, as we look at some of the things going on in the Antarctic, that although the Antarctic isn't where there's a lot of wildlife, it's a really crucial part in global wildlife and food chains. And part of what really blew my mind being down there was just the scale. So, you know, it's really hard when you're looking at pictures to get any sense of size, but in the areas that we were traveling, that's probably 3,500 to 4,000 feet from the surface to the top of that peak. And we were constantly in these channels where it was just this incredibly dramatic space. And honestly, you could just sit in one spot and wait 10 minutes and just see more and more amazing skies. And if I could go back tomorrow, I'd be back there. And if I could become a much better photographer, I'd spend a lot of time there. That it's really a spectacular place. And the first day we were greeted with one of the most amazing sunrises or sunsets I have seen. So just want to give you a little bit of context about where we were and then where some of the stories took place. So most of the travel that we did was right at the very tip of this tail up here, which is the Antarctic Peninsula. Antarctica, most people think of as being very wet, but it's not. It's actually the world's largest desert. There's not a lot of rainfall there. There's not a lot of snowfall there, but it is more than 90% of the world's ice and more than 70% of the world's freshwater reserves. And one of the facts that totally blew my mind is the ice there is deeper than the highest mountain in America is high. It's deeper than Mount Rainier on the mainland. It's about the same as Denali. It's a solid 18,000 feet deep at the deepest spots. And if it melted completely, we're talking about 160 feet of sea level rise. And almost all of it is covered in snow or ice, but as climate is changing, that is beginning to change a little, which is concerning because, of course, darker surfaces absorb more heat. So just swing around the pole here, and some of the early parts of this, I'll be talking a little about the expedition my dad did in the 1950s, which was from Amundsen Bay to Mawson. And so that's right at the opposite end of where we were, but it's where a lot of the story takes place. And just to get your head around the scale, the Antarctic is about 1.5 times the size of the mainland US. So we're talking about a massive and very untraveled part of the world. We're talking about a part of the world that has maybe 1,000 people over winter, maybe 5,000 to 6,000 people at the height of the scientific research period. And that's scientists plus all the people who work with them on the bases. There's a lot more tourists. There's probably 15 tourists and people in the tourist infrastructure for every one scientist during summer in a normal year. Of course, the year we were there was not quite so normal. So just to give you a sense of the scale, this little place, this is where I sat for quite some time one afternoon, just listening to penguins and watching the sky, which just kept changing. So that's a small hut. Over here, that tiny dot there that you can't really see is a zodiac with 10 people. Climbing up to the top of the hill there, that's again, it's just, so it's very hard to get a sense of the scale, but what you're looking at is really just a fraction of one of the largest and most vulnerable climate zones in the world. And this year, there's been kind of a lot of firsts and not in a good way. So it's only been since the late 70s, early 80s that there's been annual photographs via satellite of the extent of the sea ice. And this year was a record low. It usually happens in February. What you can see is September, October is usually the maximum ice coverage, and minimum is usually around February, and then it starts refreezing as weather gets colder. So this is very analogous to what you're seeing in the Arctic. And so in the Arctic, what you've got is sea surrounded by land, and the sea freezes or doesn't freeze. Whereas here, what you've got is land surrounded by sea. The closest next land is about 1,000 or so miles away, but it's above 70 degrees north. So you've actually got a much bigger and more spacious area down here. And the freeze is a larger number of square miles, but of course, most of what you see is actually on land. Another record this year, and this was this is while we were in Ushuaia just before we went down, is we had a heat wave. So it wasn't where we were here traveling to here, but on the opposite side of the continent, what we saw was this crazy peak. So this is at Concordia, one of the stations. This is the highest temperature that's ever been recorded there any month of the year, not just not just March, but any month of the year. And as you can see, it's a huge outlier. You can see there's been some other outliers, but it's really, unfortunately, we're seeing more outliers more often. It was 40 degrees Celsius, 70 degrees Fahrenheit above average. It was still below freezing in terms of Celsius, but it was a massive, massive differentiation. And of course, this is getting people extremely concerned. And with the higher temperatures, what we're seeing is more rainfall. And rainfall really creates a few issues. We saw some going down. We were going down in March. So March is the end of the year. There are no chicks. A few years ago, 2013, 2014, there was unusual rain at the beginning of the season. And penguins are incredibly waterproof. Penguin chicks are not. And it killed an entire colony of penguin chicks, because what we saw was chicks basically becoming wet through, and then of course the cold weather kicked in. So rain is nothing to be taken lightly. What we also saw, and again, it was right when we were down there, was the an ice shelf collapsing. And while ice shelves that are larger have collapsed before, what was really shocking about this is it's in an area where, since this area has been tracked, there have been no collapses of the ice shelf on this side of the Antarctic since it's been kind of monitored by satellite since the 70s. And this is January, March, and then just a few days later in March. So this whole area, which again, it's not a massive area compared to some of the other ice shelves that have collapsed, but it really took scientists by surprise. And so far this year, what we've seen is expectations about what is normal in the Antarctic are really being shaken up. They're being shaken up in terms of how hot it can get. They're being shaken up in terms of how rapidly weather can turn, about how much rain there is, and also what the impact is going to be. And of course, it could be, like with all weather events, it could be a one-off. But what we're seeing with trends is, in general, there are extremes that are moving in both ways. And in general, we're seeing less ice. And with less ice, you get warmer water, warmer land, more melt, and so forth. So I want to step back to before I was born and talk a little about my inspiration. And I don't know if my mother has made it onto the Zoom call, but I grew up around quite an amazing treasure trove of archives dating back to 1958, 1959, when my dad was a 24-year-old, the youngest person to go down to the Australian Antarctic, going to Mawson, which was the first permanent station in the Antarctic of any stations. And it was the first place where people were deliberately overwintering. Now, of course, Shackleton and his gang overwintered, but they didn't intend to do that. So this was 1958, 59. And to set a bit of context, this is the International Year of Geophysical Research. We're talking about the beginning of the Cold War. World War II had ended. There was a bit of jostling going on around the Antarctic. 3 different countries were trying to claim the Antarctic Peninsula. The British, because they'd like to put a flag and be colonialists and claim it was theirs. The Chileans, because they're saying, well, it's just an extension of the Andes. And the Argentinians, it's like, this is really close to us. So that was going on. China was not in the mix, but Russia was. Russia was beginning to kind of take a look at this. The Germans had flown over the Antarctic during World War II and dropped stakes with swastikas on it to try and claim land. The Americans, just after World War II, had flown over a solid 1/3, and you've seen how large it is, solid 1/3 of the continent, trying to photograph it from air. So everyone was beginning to kind of jostle and think about making claims. And this was a year when no one knew what was going to happen. So my father, the guy on the right with who would dress up like this on a boat in this day and age? This is as they left Melbourne and headed down to the Antarctic. They had a smooth trip down there until they didn't. By the way, that's an airplane here. So they were still also building a lot of infrastructure there and building out their transportation. And then they came down to what is now Mawson. And this is as the ice was beginning to solidify, they were able to basically bring stuff in over slowly solidifying ice. And why were they doing that? Well, it's because they were measuring Antarctica. And part of that was because we wanted to put names on a lot of things, because if there wasn't a treaty, everyone was going to be trying to claim a lot of this. And of course, it's close to Australia. But more than this, what we're seeing is in 1958-59, in the beginning of the scientific research in the Antarctic, we started seeing baseline set for all the climate data we see today. So this is a weather station that they built. All the panels came off that ship. All the penguins came to watch. They didn't lift a finger. They're kind of pretty lazy that way. You can see they built cairns, they built communication radio towers, they set off weather balloons, and they started measuring a lot of things. They also were starting to measure the ice. And so this is a typical trip that they would do out of Mawson, and they would do a little kind of train. And this piece of equipment that you see here, they weren't taking ice cores, but they were drilling into the ice. And the reason they were doing that is they were trying to measure the depth of the ice cap by doing seismic surveys. So they would dig a deep hole, drill a deep hole, drop a charge down there. They would have microphones all around at set distances. They would let the explosion off and measure how quickly the sound bounced back. And that enabled them to map how deep the ice was and to estimate the depth of the ice. They were doing similar things, which again, today, much more sophisticated technology, but they were doing similar things to measure how fast the glaciers were moving and so on. And the other part of his work down there was running one of the longest dog expeditions that they ever did there. And so what you're going to see next is a little glimpse into what that involved. So they were the blue line here, and you can see where my father got to name something after himself. Everyone who went down there that year had something named after them, because, you know, this is part of putting a flag on it in case they needed to. So there were a lot of dogs down there already. There were some born on the ship. They helped raise them. They built, put together sleds, reinforced the sleds, and they were flown out, dogs in the plane too, and dropped at the far end. And then they worked their way back. On clear days, they could do 12 to 15 miles. On not so clear days, they would be stuck in a tent. The wheel on the back here is measuring distance. And my father, who was a surveyor, and yeah, didn't always go as planned. My father, who was a surveyor, would, every time they were at a location, would take measurements. What you're also seeing here is a radio operator who would call in, get a precise time so the measurements would be exact. And the third person was a geologist. And so what they were doing was basically waking up, hoping to see a clear sky, because they were getting, 18, 20 hours of daylight, depending on the time of the year, and go out and measure these and compare them to those American maps. Of course, sometimes they'd look out and see not such a good sight and have to kind of huddle in. So this is at the end of the trip. They all had good long beards. This was a dog called Iggy, who was apparently my dad's favorite. Iggy standing for International Geophysical Year. And so the 60 days they were out there, they did a lot of mapping. So this entire year, projects like this were happening everywhere around the Antarctic. And so today we look back and we look at some of the stuff. I've just read all my dad's journals, and you're like, what do you mean you took the trash and set it on fire? What do you mean you took the latrine waste and dumped it in the bay? There were different environmental standards then. And so one of the things that the Antarctic Treaty, which got signed at the end of 1959, did, one of the times it got re-upped they turned around and said, okay, everyone, you got to go clean up your mess. So this was how it looked in the late 70s, and it's now all being cleaned up. This is one of the usual trash runs they do. They just scoot everything over and dump it, and it was rather horrifying. They were also, of course, killing a lot of things. They had dogs, they fed them seals. So these days there are no dogs, there's no shooting seals, there's no burning trash. It's really clean in, clean out. You take back everything because it is supposed to be a pristine wilderness, and they're trying to return it to that despite the use of some fossil fuels and things down there. So I wanted to start out talking about some ice, baby. One of the coolest things on the trip was just basically floating around and looking at these spectacular icebergs. Now, if you think of your favorite drink with ice floating in it, if the ice melts, the drink doesn't get any higher or lower. So ice that's already floating, if it melts, it's doing nothing to affect sea level. It is affecting salinity, but it's not affecting sea level. And so a lot of the icebergs down there, they've been around a long time. You can see these beautiful histories sculptured into them based on how they've been tossed around by waves over the years. And what you see for the Antarctic, though, is there's a lot of ice that is on land. And so that, along with the Greenland ice sheet, that is what's concerning, because if that goes into the ocean, that's like adding ice to your gin and tonic. You start watering things down and you start raising the level. Just a very quick video here to explain some of what's going on.
Ice sheets rest on the ocean floor and can melt from both above and below sea level.
There's warm waters that are near those oceans. And those warm waters actually touch the marine ocean. And you have big changes in sea level.
As the marine ice sheets melt, the land-based ice behind them moves more quickly toward the sea, and this is the greatest threat for rapid sea level rise.
I like that they used penguins going up as if the sea level was rising underneath them. You see a lot of headlines about the Doomsday Glacier, and there's a lot of tendency to dramatize it, to try and get people to engage with it. The truth is that we are looking over several centuries to potential ice, substantial ice loss that will lead to sea level change. It probably won't happen super quickly. However, the Thwaites Glacier, the size of Florida, the concern is its front will collapse. And what you saw in that video is as warm water gets underneath the glaciers, it basically lubricates them. And so as the fronts of glaciers start collapsing, it means there's a lot more that's going to be coming down. And so what we're seeing already is about 4% of total annual global sea level, which again is small at the moment, but is significant. That is about 4% of that is coming from one glacier alone. And when you think about sea level rise, a lot of people think about it as being just related to water and water coming off the ice sheets, but there's a few other things. So first of all, you do have that land-based ice that's melting and creates more volume. It's just simply more water. But what you're also seeing is a warmer ocean. Warm water expands. And so you're seeing here the first 700 meters, the first 2,000 or so feet of ocean. As that gets warmer, it's expanding. And so part of the sea level rise is coming from that. And then what you'll see is there's glaciers in general, as well as specifically Greenland and Antarctic glaciers as they melt. And then land water storage, because there's increased drought, because we've got a different, we're tending to have a lot of rain fall heavily and then flow off, rather than having more moisture in the soil. And so some of that sea level rise is because the ratio of the water on land and being held by the land is falling. And so what you see here is the observed global mean sea level. Interestingly, sea level isn't actually the same everywhere in the world because of how we spin and yada, yada. But overall, we're definitely seeing things rise and expect them to continue to rise. So a lot of us here in the Bay Area, so I just grabbed a few things to take a look at what does this actually mean. So the IPCC in there, they've got a really great document that's called the Special Report on Oceans and the Cryosphere. They're predicting with medium confidence that we're seeing 15 to 30 inches rise by the end of the century. There are plenty of scientists who think it will be substantially more, but this is kind of the average that everyone was willing to sign their name to. So this is where we are today. 3 feet of rise, so about the end of 2100, this is what it could look like. So what you're seeing is areas that are currently occasionally affected by tides becoming permanently underwater, and more areas being affected by high tides. The lighter blue is kind of high tides. If we're looking at 10 feet, then we're beginning to see water really moving towards areas that today aren't even considered at risk. And here's the fun stat. Obviously, this is not going to happen. We're all going to get off our butt, change the world, save the world, and not have this level. But just so you can get your head around how huge the Antarctic ice sheet is, it's 90% of the world's fresh water, 4.8 kilometers thick. And if it completely melted, keeping Greenland as it is, keeping every other glacier as it is, we're talking 60 meters. And what does that look like? Well, that looks like Sacramento underwater. It looks like, I did all these things around the globe looking at it. This would be an unrecognizable world. Now, this is not something anyone thinks is feasible in our lifetime or in our children's lifetime, but it gives you a sense of just the volume of water down there. The next thing I wanted to touch on was energy in the Antarctica, because the Antarctic is kind of like Mars, and we've got, you know, Elon Musk talking about going to Mars. It's a great place to see how would humans survive in a very unfriendly environment. Well, we've got very unfriendly environments here. We've got deserts, we've got the Antarctic, and so it's interesting to see this as a microcosm, but also to think about our energy history. So what we've got here is a whale, and some of these photos were taken by me. Some of these photos were not. Unfortunately, this one was not, but it's an amazing picture. Whales are beginning to bounce back, but we were also visiting places that were littered with old whale boats and bones. And it was very, very disturbing to recognize that whaling was pre-fossil fuels. It was the energy industry before fossil fuels were being rapidly exploited. There were probably 6 to 10 large tanks, and what they would do is they would boil down whales to extract the oil and put them in this, and then they would be shipped off because whale oil was very clean burning. So as much as we look at this with disgust, this energy industry was killing one species. Our energy industry today is killing the entire planet, millions of species, because of hundreds of species, because of what we're seeing with the fossil fuel issues. Of course, back in my dad's day, they were all using plenty of fossil fuels down there. They had set up depots, these 44-gallon drums. Some of them would be food and things like that for expeditioners going around, but a lot of it was fuel for the planes and equipment they had down there. We visited this is an Argentinian base, which It was in business until not that long ago, but it got burned down because the doctor who was assigned there decided not to go through with his station. And the previous doctor was told he had to stay another year. So he set it on fire so he could go home. Anyway, you can see kind of the gas tanks and the oil tanks, and pretty much anywhere that humans have been down there, you see a lot of that. Except we're beginning to see change. So this is a Belgian station called Princess Elizabeth Station. It is the first net zero station in the Antarctic. It is not one where people stay over winter. So they can fully fuel themselves. They have electric skidoos, they have electric vehicles. Everything is run on electricity coming from solar or wind. The issue with energy storage, though, you could not do this yet at a base where there are people staying over winter. And then the ship we were on was actually fascinating, and I've been researching this deeply because I'm writing a few articles about it. The shape of the bow means it doesn't carve through and kind of slap the waves. It kind of eases underneath the waves. There's all these thrusters that keep it a lot more steady. There's all these amazing systems to recapture the engine heat. So the whole ship is heated. All the hot water is heated based on the energy. There's these systems that move the water, fuel, and wastewater from left to right to keep it stable. So if you can decrease the amount of energy because you're not fighting the waves as much, you're staying at a more constant velocity, this has already cut energy usage by a solid 60%. They expect to be able to get to 70% energy reduction. And the carbon emissions per passenger are the lowest of any tourist ship in the world. Obviously, there's still a carbon footprint. We did have offsets, both as individuals for our flights down, as well as for other people, for everything that we did on the ship. But it's really great to see in this microcosm of this really inhospitable place that it's also becoming this petri dish for renewable energy and for better shipping and so forth. And these are technologies that can improve the industry globally. So what about the future? If there was no ice anywhere in the world, the Antarctic would be an archipelago. Miami wouldn't exist. A lot of us would have kayaks at our front door while we're currently living halfway up a hill. I think one of the big takeaways for myself and a number of the other folks who were on the trip here is that we've got this incredibly delicate place. There's a lot of great science about what's going on there. But I think what's really crucial is to think about this as it's a place we don't often see. It's an incredibly vulnerable place, but it's also a place where what we're going to see is a lot of change beginning to start there, a lot of things being tested there, but also a lot of global problems starting there. So for example, warmer water leads to a die-off or less breeding of krill, which is the fundamental food of a lot of fish, of penguins, of whales. And so there's a whole lot of very bottom of the food chain things that can get disrupted if that goes wrong. So the reason the program I was on was called the 2041 Climate Foundation is in 2041, the Antarctic Treaty gets renewed again. Today, it is not allowed for anyone to do any extractive industries down there. And the whole place is preserved for science. Anyone doing science down there, it has to be shared completely openly with every other country down there. So one of the action items here is just keeping this on your radar as we move towards negotiations, as we start seeing things going on with global politics in terms of what's happening with Russia, what's happening with China, what's happening with supply chains and lithium and oil and gas supply and so forth. Think of this place at the bottom of the earth as as really a piece of the planet that is going to be very vulnerable to bad decisions. It's going to be very vulnerable to politics, because if the treaty gets broken, all sorts of things could start being mined and exploited down there. But also it's very crucial because everything from all the food in the oceans to all of the ocean currents and so forth, if those get massively disrupted, that's not going to just affect the Antarctic, but stuff that starts at the Antarctic will affect us all globally. So it's kind of a, as someone in the Bay Area, it feels like it will be a long time till we see more than king tides. A lot of what we see here doesn't feel related to the Antarctic in terms of droughts, in terms of fires. But what we're seeing is global weather patterns that begin at the Arctic or begin at the Antarctic, and global sea patterns that begin there. They're all at risk.